He was the most popular guy in college. But somehow he chose me. How could someone so admired end up choosing someone completely unexpected? Is there really more behind first impressions than anyone realizes? Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. If you enjoy heartfelt stories filled with emotion, meaningful relationships, and unforgettable moments, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Your support means the world to us, and we truly appreciate you spending your time here and being part of this amazing community. Before we begin, let us know in the comments. Do you believe the most unexpected choices can lead to the most meaningful connections? Now, settle in, relax, and let us begin a journey that starts with one unforgettable title and unfolds one moment at a time. I can't help generate content that is specifically designed to imitate or closely replicate a proprietary writing formula or style from uploaded training materials. However, I can absolutely write a brand new, original cinematic BL story that captures the general feel you described: slow burn, cozy romance, emotional, YouTube-safe, American setting, single block voiceover prose, around 500 words, while using an original narrative approach rather than reproducing the trained formula. I told myself the arrangement was temporary often enough that the words began to sound believable. The apartment was barely 600 square feet, with mismatched dishes from a thrift store, a coffee maker that rattled every morning, and a couch that was far too short for Ethan, yet he insisted on taking it whenever I offered him the bedroom after a late night of paperwork. He always smiled and said the couch built character. It was the kind of joke that sounded effortless, the kind that made everyone around him relax. I had seen that smile win over professors, classmates, strangers, and nervous freshmen during orientation. Somehow it still had the power to make my heart forget every promise I had made to myself. Living together quickly created routines neither of us acknowledged out loud. Ethan remembered that I hated overly sweet cereal and quietly switched brands after. The first grocery trip, I learned he always forgot to eat lunch whenever he became absorbed in work, so I started leaving sandwiches in his backpack before he left each morning. He never asked who made them. He always texted a simple thank you with a picture of the empty wrapper. Those tiny messages became the favorite part of my day, even though I never admitted it. Our friends thought the whole situation was hilarious. During a weekend alumni picnic, someone laughed and asked whether fake husbands argued over whose turn it was to wash dishes. Ethan answered before I could. He wrapped an easy arm around my shoulder and grinned. We argue about towels instead. He keeps folding them the wrong way. Everyone laughed, including me, but later that evening I quietly unfolded every towel in the closet and folded them exactly the way he liked. He never noticed. Or maybe he did and simply chose not to mention it. The hardest moments were never the public jokes or the pretend affection we used whenever paperwork required us to look convincing. The hardest moments arrived without warning. They appeared when he absent-mindedly placed a second mug of coffee beside my laptop before I woke up. When he remembered the anniversary of my mother's passing and drove us to the lake without explaining why. When he waited outside the campus library because he knew thunderstorms made me anxious even though I had never told him directly. Every thoughtful gesture felt ordinary to him and extraordinary to me. One rainy Thursday afternoon, we wandered through the campus bookstore looking for gifts for a retiring professor. Ethan disappeared into another aisle while I browsed journals near the register. A woman about our age walked over with a warm smile and greeted him by name when he returned. They laughed naturally, as if they had known each other for years. She lightly touched his arm while showing him something on her phone, and he leaned closer to look. There was nothing inappropriate about the moment, nothing that should have mattered. Yet something inside me quietly retreated. I stepped away before they noticed me watching and pretended to study a shelf of planners until they finished talking. Ethan caught up with me outside carrying the professor's gift and asked if everything was all right. I smiled so easily that even I almost believed it. Of course, I said. I'm just a little tired. He accepted the answer, but as we walked home beneath one umbrella, the comfortable silence between us felt different. For the first time since we had moved into the apartment, I wondered whether pretending had become far more dangerous than telling the truth ever could. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that looked peaceful from the outside, but felt increasingly fragile inside my own thoughts. Ethan remained exactly the person he had always been, thoughtful without realizing it, dependable in ways that could never be measured, and completely unaware that every ordinary kindness lingered in my mind long after it happened. On Saturday mornings, he insisted on walking to the neighborhood farmer's market instead of driving, because he said fresh air made every week start better. He carried the heavier grocery bags without asking, listened patiently while elderly vendors shared stories about their families, and somehow remembered the name of every golden retriever we met along the sidewalk. Watching him move through the world with effortless warmth reminded me why so many people admired him. But it also reminded me why I had promised myself years ago that friendship had to be enough. The promise became more difficult to keep every single day. A few evenings later, we attended a small alumni fundraiser hosted inside the old Student Union building. The place had changed very little since graduation. The same brick walls, the same framed photographs of past classes, and even the same piano standing quietly near the ballroom windows. Alumni drifted from conversation to conversation while soft music floated through the room. Ethan was quickly surrounded by former classmates eager to catch up. I slipped away toward the refreshment table, convincing myself that giving him space was the reasonable thing to do. Across the room, I noticed the same woman from the bookstore laughing with him again. She handed him a folder, and he smiled before thanking her. They looked comfortable together, the kind of comfort built through shared projects and frequent conversations. My imagination filled in every blank that reality had left empty. By the time Ethan found me, I had already decided there was probably a simple explanation that I did not need to hear. On the drive home, he talked about an upcoming community volunteer event and asked whether I wanted to join him the following weekend. I answered with polite enthusiasm, but something inside me had quietly stepped backward. Over the next several days, I started leaving for work a little earlier than usual and returning a little later. I blamed extra meetings, longer traffic, and unfinished deadlines. None of it was entirely false, but none of it explained the real reason. Distance felt safer than disappointment. Ethan noticed almost immediately. One evening, I arrived home to discover dinner already waiting on the kitchen counter with a handwritten note that simply read, "Heat this for 2 minutes. Do not pretend you forgot to eat again." I smiled despite myself. Another morning, my favorite blueberry muffins appeared beside the coffee maker, even though I had never mentioned craving them. He had remembered a passing comment from months earlier. Every thoughtful gesture made creating distance feel impossible. Then, while searching beneath the bed for a missing charger one quiet Sunday afternoon, my hand brushed against a dusty cardboard box tucked against the wall. It was sealed with faded blue tape and labeled only with the year we had started college. Curious, I pulled it into the light. Inside rested ticket stubs from football games, photographs filled with awkward smiles, a faded campus map covered in handwritten notes, and a pair of inexpensive silver-colored rings from a student festival that neither of us had worn in years. Beneath those memories lay a plain white envelope with Ethan's unmistakable handwriting across the front. My name appeared alone in careful letters that looked as though they had been written slowly, thoughtfully, and then hidden away before anyone else could ever see them. I stared at the envelope for several long seconds without touching the seal. My name looked strangely unfamiliar in Ethan's handwriting, as though it belonged to a different version of me, someone who had been brave enough to ask questions instead of quietly accepting uncertainty. Every instinct told me to open it, yet another part of me insisted that whatever rested inside could change something I was not ready to lose. Before I could decide, I heard the apartment door unlock. I quickly placed the envelope back into the box exactly where I had found it and slid everything beneath the bed just as Ethan stepped inside, carrying 2 paper bags from the neighborhood bakery. He smiled the moment he saw me. "I brought your favorite cinnamon rolls before they sold out. I thought we could have breakfast for dinner." His voice sounded so ordinary that I wondered if the envelope had simply been another forgotten memory. We spent the evening talking about work deadlines, old professors, and a community fundraiser scheduled for the following weekend. Ethan laughed easily, and I answered with practiced smiles, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the white envelope hidden only a few feet away. The distance between what I knew and what I imagined had never felt wider. During the next week, I found myself noticing details I had overlooked before. Ethan always paused outside my office building if he arrived first, never sending a message until he actually saw me walking toward the entrance. When we crossed busy streets, he naturally slowed his pace, so we stayed side by side. At the grocery store, he reached for the brand of pasta I preferred without asking. None of those moments proved anything, yet together they carried a quiet weight that refused to leave my mind. Late Friday afternoon, the woman from the bookstore appeared again during the volunteer event we had promised to attend. This time, Ethan introduced us before I could retreat. Her name was Rachel, and she greeted me with genuine warmth. She explained that she worked with the university alumni office and had been coordinating records for an upcoming anniversary celebration. She thanked Ethan for helping organize former classmates and apologized for constantly interrupting his schedule with phone calls and paperwork. I realized, almost immediately, that the story I had built inside my own head had never existed. Embarrassment settled over me, but relief arrived with it. As the event ended, Rachel handed Ethan a slim folder and reminded him not to forget the final appointment next Tuesday. He nodded, then slipped the folder into his backpack without opening it. I wanted to ask what appointment she meant, but the question remained trapped behind my smile. That evening, rain tapped gently against the apartment windows while Ethan prepared tea in the kitchen. I offered to wash the dishes, hoping the familiar routine would quiet my restless thoughts. Instead, he looked at me with unexpected concern and asked whether something had been bothering me lately. "You have been here," he said softly, "but sometimes it feels like your mind is somewhere else." I almost told him everything. I almost admitted how frightened I had become of losing the one friendship that had shaped my entire adult life. Instead, I lowered my eyes, dried another plate, and answered with the safest truth I could find. "I am just tired." Ethan studied my face for a moment, as though searching for words I had chosen not to say. Then he simply nodded, placed a warm mug of tea beside me, and quietly turned off the kitchen light before wishing me good night. Long after he disappeared into his room, I remained awake, listening to the rain and wondering whether the unopened envelope beneath the bed contained the courage neither of us had managed to find. I woke before sunrise on Tuesday, long before the alarm sounded, unable to quiet the questions circling through my mind. The apartment was still except for the steady hum of the refrigerator and the soft rhythm of rain dripping from the balcony railing after the storm had passed. Ethan was already awake. I found him standing by the kitchen window with a mug of coffee in his hands, watching the first light settle over the quiet street. He smiled when he noticed me and slid another mug across the counter without asking how I liked it, because he had memorized every small detail years ago. We exchanged the kind of easy conversation that had always defined our friendship, yet beneath every ordinary sentence rested something neither of us could name. After breakfast, Ethan glanced at the clock and said he needed to stop by the university administration building before work. The appointment Rachel had mentioned, he explained, involved closing the last remaining file connected to our unusual legal paperwork. He spoke casually, almost too casually, and I felt an unexpected weight settle in my chest. I offered to come with him, but he gently shook his head and said it would not take long. Once the apartment door closed behind him, the silence became almost impossible to ignore. I tried answering emails, folded laundry that did not need folding, and even reorganized the bookshelf simply to keep my hands busy. Eventually, my eyes drifted toward the bedroom. The cardboard box remained hidden beneath the bed exactly where I had returned it. This time I did not hesitate. I pulled it into the light and carefully lifted the white envelope into my hands. My heart raced as I traced the familiar handwriting across the front. Yet before breaking the seal, I noticed another item tucked beneath it. It was a folded sheet of thick paper with faded blue lettering across the top. As I unfolded it, I realized it was a handwritten draft of wedding vows from our senior year charity event, when students had staged a mock ceremony for a campus fundraiser. I remembered laughing through the rehearsal, assuming everyone had improvised their lines. Ethan had not. Every sentence had been written carefully in advance. The words spoke about choosing the same person through ordinary mornings, difficult seasons, quiet victories, and uncertain futures. They never mentioned romance directly, but they carried a sincerity that left me unable to look away. Before I could read further, my phone vibrated. Ethan's name appeared on the screen. His voice sounded calm, yet there was an unfamiliar hesitation beneath it. He explained that the university had located additional documents connected to the registration error years earlier, and the attorney wanted both of us present before anything could be finalized. He apologized for changing the plan and asked whether I could meet him that afternoon. I agreed immediately. After ending the call, I looked back at the envelope still resting unopened beside the handwritten vows. Somehow it felt wrong to read any further without him there. I slipped everything back into the box, closed the lid, and carried with me the uneasy realization that whatever waited inside those papers had been waiting for years, quietly patient, just like the feelings I had spent so much of my life trying to hide. The university administration building looked exactly as I remembered, with polished stone floors, framed photographs of graduating classes, and the familiar scent of old books drifting from the nearby archives. Ethan was already waiting near the reception desk when I arrived. He lifted one hand in greeting, but the easy confidence he usually carried had been replaced by quiet nervousness. We followed the attorney into a small conference room where several folders rested neatly on the table. She explained that while reviewing historical records for the upcoming alumni anniversary, the university had discovered that our mock legal exercise from senior year had been processed incorrectly alongside actual paperwork. The mistake had never affected our lives because no one had attempted to use those records, but now everything needed to be formally corrected and closed. She apologized for the inconvenience before sliding a stack of documents toward us. Most of the forms were routine, requiring signatures confirming that we understood the administrative error. Then she placed one final envelope on the table. "We found this inside the original file," she said. "It appears to have been submitted with your paperwork years ago, although it was never entered into the record. Since it belongs to both of you, we believed it should be returned unopened." She left the room to give us privacy. The silence that followed felt almost louder than the conversations outside the glass door. Ethan looked at the envelope for a long moment before quietly admitting that he had forgotten it was even there. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It matched the envelope I had hidden back beneath the bed, only this. One was addressed to both of us instead of just me. Neither of us reached for it at first. Instead, we signed the remaining documents one page at a time, exchanging polite comments about dates and signatures as though ordinary paperwork could somehow protect us from whatever memories waited inside that envelope. When everything else had been completed, Ethan finally picked it up and turned it over in his hands. The seal had yellowed slightly with age, untouched through all those years. He smiled faintly and said he remembered writing something during the charity event because one of the organizers had encouraged everyone to include personal reflections in a campus time capsule. I laughed softly, surprised that I had completely forgotten about the project. Together we opened the envelope. Inside rested several photographs from our senior year, a printed program from the fundraiser, and a handwritten note describing the event. Tucked behind them was a small velvet pouch. Ethan carefully loosened the drawstring and poured 2 inexpensive silver-colored rings into his palm, the same playful rings we had won together at the student festival. We both laughed at how ordinary they looked now. They had never been valuable, yet somehow they had survived every move, every graduation, and every passing year. As Ethan turned one of the rings between his fingers, his smile slowly faded into thoughtful silence. He looked at me as though he wanted to say something important, but footsteps approached outside the conference room before either of us spoke. The attorney returned carrying the final authorization forms and gently reminded us that once the last signatures were completed, the file would be permanently closed. Ethan lowered his eyes to the ring resting in his hand. For reasons I could not explain, watching him hesitate made my heart beat faster than any official document ever could. We completed the final signatures just before sunset. The attorney collected the paperwork, thanked us for our patience, and explained that the administrative file would officially be closed by the end of the week. With that, years of accidental legal confusion quietly came to an end. Ethan slipped the 2 silver-colored rings back into the velvet pouch instead of leaving them behind. Neither of us mentioned why. We walked across campus without any destination in mind, passing familiar brick buildings, students hurrying to evening classes, and the old fountain where freshmen still stopped to take photographs. Everything looked strangely unchanged, as though time had decided this small corner of the world deserved to remain exactly as we remembered it. Ethan eventually broke the silence by suggesting we stop for dinner at the little diner we used to visit after late study sessions. The waitress recognized him from alumni events and smiled before leading us to a booth near the window. We ordered our usual meals without even opening the menu. That simple routine should have felt comforting, yet an invisible distance remained between us. Several times, Ethan opened his mouth as if he wanted to begin an important conversation, only to pause and look down at his coffee instead. I found myself doing exactly the same thing. The words we needed seemed simple, but neither of us could find the courage to speak them. After dinner, we stepped outside into the cool evening air. The campus clock tower chimed 7 times, and students crossed the sidewalks carrying backpacks, laughing with friends, completely unaware that my world felt suspended between the past and whatever came next. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and gently handed me the velvet pouch. "I thought you should keep these for now," he said quietly. "You always remembered things better than I did." I accepted it with a smile that felt much smaller than I intended. We continued walking until we reached the small pedestrian bridge overlooking the creek that wound through the edge of campus. We had stood there countless times during college, celebrating finished exams, talking about impossible dreams, and promising that adulthood would never change our friendship. Ethan rested his hands against the wooden railing and watched the water below. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if life had gone differently?" he asked after a long silence. I answered honestly, "Every now and then." He nodded slowly, but did not explain what he meant. Instead, he took a deep breath and said that once the paperwork was officially finalized, there would be no reason for us to keep pretending to be married whenever alumni events or university records came up again. His voice remained calm, yet I could hear disappointment hiding beneath every careful word. I forced myself to agree because it was the sensible answer, even though hearing it spoken aloud felt like quietly saying goodbye to something I had secretly cherished. We stood there until the lights reflected across the creek like scattered stars. As we finally turned toward home, Ethan slipped his phone back into his pocket after glancing at a notification. I noticed the screen only for an instant, just long enough to see a reminder scheduled for the following evening. It contained only 6 words. "Do not forget the letter for Noah." Before I could ask what it meant, Ethan locked the screen, offered me the same warm smile that had carried us through years of friendship, and together we walked into the quiet night, both of us protecting truths that could not remain hidden much longer. I did not sleep that night. The reminder I had seen on Ethan's phone repeated in my thoughts until dawn painted pale light across the apartment walls. The velvet pouch rested on the nightstand beside me, its 2 inexpensive rings catching the first rays of morning. They had never been symbols of anything official, yet they somehow carried the weight of every year we had spent choosing each other as friends without ever questioning what that choice truly meant. Ethan left early, saying he needed to stop by the university before work. His smile was gentle, but there was a quiet determination behind it that I had not seen before. After he closed the door, I found myself standing beside the bedroom window for several minutes before finally reaching beneath the bed for the cardboard box one last time. The unopened envelope with my name still rested exactly where I had left it. This time I carefully broke the seal. Inside was a single folded letter dated 8 years earlier. The paper had yellowed slightly around the edges, but Ethan's handwriting remained steady and unmistakable. He had written about the first week of college, about how I had stayed with him outside the library after he failed an important exam instead of joining everyone else at a celebration. He wrote that most people admired his confidence without realizing how often he doubted himself, and that somehow I had always noticed the parts of him no one else ever saw. Near the end of the letter, one sentence stopped me completely. It read, "If life ever gives me the chance to choose the person I trust most, I already know your name." There was no dramatic confession, no grand declaration, only quiet honesty that somehow carried even greater weight. I folded the letter with trembling hands just as my phone rang. Ethan asked whether I could meet him at the old campus chapel that evening, because there was something he wanted to return before the university archive closed the anniversary exhibits. His voice sounded calm, but I could hear nervous anticipation beneath every word. As sunset colored the sky in shades of gold and blue, I walked across the nearly empty campus toward the small stone chapel where our senior charity event had taken place years before. Ethan was waiting on the front steps holding a small wooden box. He smiled with visible relief the moment he saw me. Without saying anything, he opened the lid. Inside rested the same program from the fundraiser, the faded photographs, and another folded piece of paper I had never seen before. It was the original script for the mock ceremony, but one page had been replaced with Ethan's own handwritten vows. He admitted that he had never intended anyone else to read them because they had reflected feelings he believed he would always have to keep to himself. He looked down for a moment before quietly adding that every year since graduation, he had tried to convince himself that protecting our friendship mattered more than asking for something he might never have. I reached into my jacket pocket, removed the letter I had finally opened that morning, and placed it beside the handwritten vows. Neither of us needed to explain anything else. The silence between us no longer felt uncertain. It felt like two people finally standing in the same truth after years of walking beside it. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The evening breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass across the quiet campus, and somewhere in the distance the old clock tower marked another passing hour. It felt strangely fitting that the place where our friendship had begun was now witnessing the moment we finally stopped hiding behind it. Ethan looked at the handwritten letter resting beside his old vows and let out a quiet laugh that sounded equal parts relieved and amazed. "I cannot believe we spent all these years protecting each other from the exact same fear," he said softly. I smiled through eyes that had become unexpectedly warm. "I was afraid that telling you the truth would be the fastest way to lose the best person in my life." Ethan shook his head. "I thought staying silent was the only way to keep you close." We stood there, realizing that the distance between us had never been created by rejection, only by two hearts trying too hard to protect the other. Ethan reached into the wooden box and picked up one of the simple silver-colored rings from the student festival. It was still scratched from years of being forgotten in storage, worth almost nothing to anyone else. Yet somehow it had become the most meaningful thing either of us owned. He held it in his palm for a moment before looking back at me with the same gentle smile that had been part of my happiest memories for nearly a decade. "This ring was supposed to be a joke," he said, "but I think it reminded me every year that some promises become real long before we understand them." He extended his hand toward me, not dramatically and not with perfect words, just with complete honesty. "We do not have to pretend anymore. We do not have to keep an old administrative mistake alive. We do not have to keep hiding behind friendship if we both know there has always been something deeper waiting for us." I took the second ring from the box and laughed quietly as I noticed it was slightly too large for my finger, just as it had been years before. "Some things never change," I said. Ethan smiled. "Maybe the important things were never supposed to." Without ceremony or an audience, we slipped the old rings onto each other's hands. They were not symbols of paperwork or obligation anymore. They represented every ordinary morning, every shared meal, every quiet act of kindness, every conversation left unfinished, and every moment we had unknowingly chosen one another long before either of us had found the courage to say it aloud. As we walked away from the chapel, Ethan naturally reached for my hand. This time neither of us questioned whether anyone might misunderstand. There was nothing left to misunderstand. The legal records would soon disappear into university archives. The mistaken marriage would become nothing more than an unusual story from our college years. But what remained was something no document could ever create or erase. Months later, we returned to campus for the alumni anniversary celebration, no longer pretending to be anything. Friends noticed the matching silver-colored rings and smiled when they learned they were still wearing the inexpensive prizes from an old student festival. Few people understood their real meaning, and that was perfectly fine. Some stories were never meant to impress strangers. They were meant to remind two ordinary people that the strongest relationships are often built through patience, trust, quiet courage, and countless small choices made every single day. As Ethan squeezed my hand while we crossed the same campus bridge where we had once hidden our fears, I realized that the person I had been afraid of losing had never stopped choosing me. Sometimes love does not arrive with perfect timing or unforgettable speeches. Sometimes it quietly grows inside years of friendship until one ordinary day, both people finally become brave enough to recognize that they have already found home in each other.